Hi guys, it's Nicole. This week during our presentation, we're focusing on chapters 7 and 8 and whatever article we found to go along with it. So chapters 7 and 8 were really interesting to me. We got to look at language universals and the different rules for putting sentences together and how these sentences can still make sense in any combination of forms. This idea of language universals really stood out to me because I just kind of kept going back to when you're speaking to someone from a different country or that speaks a different language, there tends to be this commonality that you can almost understand each other just based on certain principles and things that are going on. So I really liked to read more about the parts that actually contributed to this and how those language universals actually were set up and made sense. And I also wanted to look at focusing on how this can help us in teaching ELL students, how we can maybe better incorporate their first language and their first language skills into teaching them the second language. So this week I read an article that was a summary of a study done by Lydia White and Heather Goad. Lydia and Heather are Canadian linguists that did a study on how the mother tongue affects second language acquisition. It's the title of the article as well. And it looks at the impact of syntax and morphology on second language acquisition. So the article starts out by hypothesizing that certain grammatical relationships, like morphology, phonology, syntax, may be contributing factors in the success or failure of anyone that's learning L1 to L2. These linguists in particular were focusing on people that were learning English of Mandarin Chinese and Turkish-speaking descents. So to hark back to chapter 7 of our text, these language universals are understood to mean that if we know certain characteristics of one language, there's a possibility to apply it to other languages. Furthermore, Finnegan tells us, if basic principles govern all languages, they are likely to result of whatever cognitive and social skills enabled human beings to learn language in the first place. This being said, we're implying that we can process through our thinking about the rules that govern speech in one language, we may be able to transfer these rules and ideas into another language to help us better learn and understand. So it's all kind of about the thinking process and what's going on when you learn to speak, and then transferring that into how to learn to speak another language. So I was very interested in reading these types of structures and how each one was set up and how they related to the English language, because I think that Finnegan really explained the broad terms and made it make sense that these universals really can work for any language. So the article that I read, White and Goad go even further to say that universal grammar and similar grammatical rules in learning L2 can be a huge success for the learner of the L2 language if the languages are similar. So we're really kind of boiling it down to this similarity point, which makes a lot of sense because when you're reading chapter 7 of Finnegan's text, he frequently contrasts English and Japanese, or how things work in English and Japanese. Those are examples that really stood out. And they're very, very different. So I know that if I was learning Japanese, I think that the sentences, when they're translated to English, look a little ill-formed. They're not making a lot of sense. And so I'm sure that the same is true in reverse. Hi dogs, be quiet. Thank you. Sorry, this is like the 5th time that I've taped this and the dogs just are not gonna be quiet. So we have to like kind of operate around it a little bit. So White and Goad, what they proposed is called the prosodic transfer hypothesis. And this hypothesis allows them to analyze patterns and relationships between morphology, syntax, and phonology together as one instead of looking at them separately, which really helps them to kind of evaluate a wider range of errors instead of just looking at each one separately. They can kind of see how they connect together and where the errors are formed. So what they're telling us is that this hypothesis contends that speakers misuse inflection and function words in the L2 with their L1 grammar cannot accommodate. So what we're finding is that the gaps in speech are occurring because they are too different. whatever we can use to make up, our L1 is really helping to propel us into L2 just a little bit better because we're able to fill in those gaps. But if we speak completely different languages, like in the study, the Mandarin Chinese students spoke very different language than English, those gaps are more apparent and the students are going to struggle a little bit more. So during their experimental work, this article tells us that White and Goh did in fact prove that their hypothesis would be a good indicator of the performance of an L2 student when they're learning their second language. So we can determine how successful they're going to be based on this hypothesis. What I want to try to think about and focus on is what White and Goh said at the very end of their article, is that much of what we want the L2 learners to learn in terms of syntax morphology are going to be determined by teacher talk. And this teacher talk is the language that we use in the everyday classroom. So not just lectures, but also the other stuff in between too, and everything that we're saying. And I know that this can be something that's very difficult for a lot of us to control, myself included. I have notes off to the side because I have no idea if I'm just going to ramble on and on and on. But I know that even when I'm giving directions to regular education students, I tend to kind of just put all my thoughts out there, which can be confusing to them. So I can imagine it's only confusing to an ELL student as well. My lingering questions are, as teachers, how can we better examine our own language so that we correctly model it for ELL students? That is, making sure that we're speaking English in a way that is modeled so that they're getting the grammatical and syntax correct when they're modeling after us. And also, does anyone have any type of system to evaluate what they say in the classroom on a day-to-day basis? I don't know if there's a reflection process that you use that really works, but I'd be interested to hear about it. Thanks guys, have a nice day.